Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa, between the two rivers, the Raccoon, the Des Moines. We are glad to have you with us here on Iowa Catholic Radio. Thank you to Imogene Ingredients for underwriting our show. And everybody who are the business sponsors here on Iowa Catholic Radio, thank you for making 21 years of radio possible. I'm Bo Bonner. You might know me from the morning show on Iowa Catholic Radio, where I'm the host. Bud, where might people know you?
So these days I'm at Mercy College of Health Sciences, downtown Des Moines, as the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences.
Absolutely wonderful. Like we said, you can find out so much more about Iowa Catholic Radio by going to iowacatholicradio.com. Business sponsors, live events, all of the good stuff. Bud, on the show today, we are closing up not an entire series, but the first section of the series. We have been talking about the Reconsidered Good, where we have been reconsidering, the Reconsidered Leader, I should say, a series of shows that we did back in 2022. And with 4 more years of experience, we thought it was about time to expand the show from we did that in 30-minute segments to hour segments, and really get into things. So we're closing out today the, as it were, philosophical and theological portion, kind of putting things into the grand opposition between one set of philosophical leadership values and a theological one as well. So that's what we're looking at, hopefully getting sussed out today.
Yeah, this one should be fun. I think today we're stepping into the octagon a bit because we want to take on some classic thinkers, classic in the sense of widely read, but letting folks know sort of some pitfalls to avoid, I think.
Absolutely. We'll get to move on to scriptural aspects next, and then in the third part of the reconsideration, the saints. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting the show. You can check them out and more business sponsors at the business sponsor page at iowacatholicradio.com. But we have been doing the Reconsidered Leader this year, since the new year. And like I've told people, it's us reconsidering this leadership series that we had back in 2022. That was the good old days of 30-minute shows, not ever understanding how we were able to pull that off as much as we talk. But we certainly set out a vision, we thought, of what Catholic and Christian leadership in the key of Jesus Christ must look like in order for it to be different. And we set about and made a streak of shows that I think people found helpful, but we thought it best to really dig deeper into this idea. And so that's what we've been doing the last few episodes. This is going to end the section that is more philosophical and theoretical. We've been talking about theological and theoretical concepts like kenosis, self-emptying, apophaticism, what leadership is not. We've been talking about making anti-fragile people to follow you. We've been talking about scapegoating and how to avoid that, what holiness must be, how it is that we must lead with our wounds. So all of these concepts. But today we want to talk about what is the predominant leadership model philosophically, where it comes from, and the Christian response over and against that, which, as we did in the last episode, kind of live on the air, figured this is the thing that we have to actually do. This also harkens back to another series we had both on the radio show, but things we've taught together, which is to consider how Thomas Hobbes, a political philosopher from England back in the day, to say the least, the 1600s, ended up being more elemental in ways people don't often understand. Thomas Hobbes, when you read him, can sound like, oh, there's no way that's what people think nowadays. But when you see about how the extrapolation of his worries brings us to the common era, I think this will be an enlightening show. So, Bud, I'll throw it over to you first. Who is Thomas Hobbes, and why is it? What is it that he thinks, if you're going to read him, as it were, in an introductory course?
Well, I think it's a figure like many of us where his life experience was huge in how he ended up thinking. So he's living in a time where there is division, polarization, and violence. It's in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. And we don't have time today to get into full depth of what's called the wars of religion or 30 Years' War. But certainly Europe was racked by conflict. And as Hobbes surveyed the landscape, And he was losing friends. He was seeing this kind of front and center in his life.
Losing friends to death.
Right.
Yes, not just like people
I'm
didn't
sure
like
he
him
lost
anymore.
some friends after he
Yeah, I'm
published
sure
Leviathan.
there was some hurt feelings, but you mean death.
You got to be. A lot of people died in these wars. He comes to the conclusion that the old basis for peace and unity in society no longer holds. And so Hobbes wants to put these things on a new foundation. And for Himbo, so think for a moment, like as we've been going through this series on leadership, there's all sorts of assumptions in place about who created the world, the way that the world works. And we sort of take those for granted as Catholics.
Right.
But if you're walking down the street and you ask yourself, what's sort of like, say I'm walking through downtown Des Moines, what's sort of driving the people that I'm walking by, even if as human beings we're not terribly self-reflective, there's all, to get at the heart of these matters, we have to go back to the roots sometimes and saying, like, philosophically, like when we get to core ideas, what's sort of the way that we look at the world? And I think some of the conclusions that Hobbes drew still influence people widely today, even though in schools we don't go about saying, like, I'm a Hobbesian.
Right. And, so real quick history in this one, we've talked about this elsewhere, so we don't have to unpack it completely. But what this gets to is religion, and very specifically, right, yeah. Thomas Hobbes, the era that he was in, the 30 Years' War, often known as the Wars of Religion. We are prone to think of the word religion and go sociological category, right? So these are people fighting over whether you should be Protestant or Catholic or Anabaptist. But I actually think an older understanding of religion gets at the heart of not only the conflicts of Hobbes' day, but in ours. So religion, at least one etymology of this, so I think this is Augustine, and you might be a Latin dork and contend against him, but the idea is religion comes from the word religare, and ligare is that word where we get ligaments in modern English. It's that which binds together, and so religare, that which binds us together over and over again. And so in the ancient world, medieval world, up until very recently, what we usually call quote-unquote religions, but is what binds communities together. But if you think back to our Roman Empire and how much it's played at this a role in understanding Jesus and his understanding of holiness and leadership, the Roman Empire did think religion, religare, bounded the community, but their religion was emperor worship or the gods associated with Rome. And so you look at a center of a town and you go, what is it that binds the town together again and again? It is the emperor worship. Obviously, you think about everything we said about Jesus, the scapegoat Christianity, the idea of putting a church at the center of the town, or to think about Jesus Christ in the flesh as the center of our religion. He, in his infleshed, fully human, fully divine personhood, is what religare binds us again and again. We think in the modern world, what's at the center of our towns? It's almost always financial districts. Financial considerations bind us together again and again. So there's a real way, but that the economy is our religion, at least in one sense. So for Hobbes, this question of religious wars, less than sociological categories fighting each other, the real question is what will bind the Europe, the empire, a particular state together.
Yeah.
And Hobbes sees the various religious factionalism, which again, not to go too far afield, but someone like William Cavanaugh points out was usually just a cover for trying to make a particular leader rule, that they cloaked it with religion. And so Hobbes begins to think that there is no real standard fundamental thing out there in reality that will give us that religare.
Yeah, and what's interesting, I was going back to Hobbes' writings a little bit last night because I'm a dork, and there's questions. So people today who write about Hobbes, they say, was he an atheist? Because if you follow his philosophy out to its logical conclusions, it feels that way. You dig into his writings, and he kind of punts on the question.
Right.
Like at times he writes about God, but for him, he's trying to put human thought and the organization of society on what he considers a purely rationalistic basis. And so he says, like, we have to sort of bracket old school theological assumptions. And he was kind of infatuated with mathematics. And the way that this works out is
all facts. Everybody loved math. It's
be careful about studying math, folks.
Yeah, anyway, keep going. Sorry.
Is he kind of boils down like human activity to bodies in motion.
And this is interesting. I just
ahead.
interrupted you. Go right back to you. It's interesting because what we're about to talk about is the sort of what seems like the irrationality of his politics. But he does this all because he's being super rationalist, bracketing like religious considerations. And like you said, in a way, he acts like he has a philosophy of physics, body in motion. Okay, sorry, keep going.
No, so I mean, body is in motion, and he wants to establish some sort of like what he considers a purely like reasonable system for organizing society, and this, he goes back to like the very origins of things.
Yes.
And for him, as he looks out at the world, I think he sees the ways that we structure things, and he sees those as, in so many words, just kind of like pragmatic considerations that we've landed on, because he says you strip away the vanities and some of the externals and things like that, and what you get back to at its core is that human beings are violent and self-protective. So ironically, like, he's trying to set things on a rational basis, but he almost kind of pens this origin story that runs contrary to Christianity. In his famous book, Leviathan, where he sort of distilled all these things and brought them together, he says, in such condition, the state of nature, there's no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain. You see, like, my commentary for a moment. The fruit of your labor will be uncertain in the state of nature because others will always want to seize it and grab it. And consequently, no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing, such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letter, no society. And this is the key here, and which is worst of all, continual fear and the danger of violent death. And the life of man in the state of nature would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And so for him, you know, for Hobbes, this is not only an origin story, but it's his understanding of human beings. And as he considers human beings, he says, we're basically selfish, we're self-protective, and unless there's sort of like structure that can be imposed on the world, even our industry will come to naught because others will take it from us violently.
You know, it's interesting, bud, I got to discipline myself not to just now talk philosophically about Hobbes. But I forgot that in that long lead up to the famous line, which is the very last one that you did about like
Life
short,
being nasty,
brutish,
short, yeah.
That really, it starts out that he's like, you really can't have economics in the state of nature.
Yeah.
Like that, he really is like, he's being a pragmatic businessman. It makes sense the role England had and was trying to establish over the face of the earth at that point as the dominant seafaring industrial, well, not industrial yet, but seafaring mercantile empire, right? And but it's interesting, and this will sound like I'm just being egg-headed, but it gets to what I think we're pushing with leadership. Hobbes goes, I'm going to be utterly rational to point out that humans are not rational. And so it's interesting, you know, we have this larger question like, okay, Hobbes, well, where does rationality eventually sprinkle in that you can make this unbiased, rational description of humans as primarily irrational and violent? So on one hand, that's sort of like a paradox that I don't think he himself answers. But it is interesting, Bud, that you start to see this in a lot of understandings of leaders. Is leaders somehow, some way, maybe it's math or physics, but somehow they have this sort of neutral observational field where they get to be rational, but everybody else is just a body in motion.
Yeah.
And you see this in a lot of the sort of metric-based decision-making gamuts that people have about leadership, that essentially you as a leader have this privileged epistemological ability to be rational, and everyone else is a body in motion that you have to make decisions that you would make about like commodities or things like this. And so right out of the gate, before we get into, I think, the real problem with Hobbes and leadership, is there's this first question to always a leader should ask is, why do you think you know more than everyone else? Now, let me point out, I hope every leader that exists does know at least something more than their followers, right? We talked about the importance of followership last week, and that it's important to say, okay, well, they know where we're going in a way that I don't yet. I can get there and learn, but I hope that my leader knows something I don't. But I think it's important for leaders to ask, well, why do you think you have, like, why do you have some information that someone else doesn't? But just to preview about the second half of the show, it's a lot different to go, well, I have a perspective that's better than theirs versus I have been given something that is my responsibility to steward and bring forward. And that's why I have a different perspective. But Hobbes doesn't fundamentally answer, I alone am rational enough to point out that humans are irrational.
Yeah.
It's an interesting paradox.
Well, as we're talking about all of this, it calls to mind, funny enough, John Henry Newman, where Newman at times, he talks about how one of the fundamental mistakes of the modern world is rationalism and setting human reason above revelation.
Yep.
And I feel like sometimes on the show, even talking to people when we're out and about and seeing them and talking about the show, you know, there is this sense that you can get is like, why do you guys geek out so much? Like, and we do get sometimes pretty deep into theology, but these things are foundational. And it's funny enough, this is what we've already used this term, but like what's ironic about Hobbes is he wants to reestablish human society on a rationalist foundation, but he ends up, I feel like, falling into the trap that he's trying to avoid.
Yes.
So like when we talk about the wars of religion, he's disturbed by this and he's like, look, the old answers, they're not panning out. But he doesn't seem to realize that like much of what's driving the violence is that people have bracketed certain understandings of the common good, and they want to boil everything down to economic considerations, the control of land and industry and things like that.
It's funny that what he's worried about is, oh my goodness, there's all these very newly powerful absolutist states that are really throwing their weight around in order to choose religion. And the only answer is more absolutist statehood, which this is where we should go next, right? What is his answer then, Bud, to go, okay, well, if life is brutish, short, mean, horrible, vile in the state of nature, how do we raise above the state of nature? And here I think is where Hobbes, right, is innovative, is he wants to say, well, it's not just like, well, British manners came along and all were saved.
Yeah.
He says, okay, something has to happen in the beginning to make it where this violence that everybody, as it were, utilizes their own possession is mitigated in a way that, you know, there's space safe enough to have commerce, to have everything that eventually leads to, like, you know, civilization, society, poetry, religion, etc.
Well, remember, Hobbes said that in the state of nature, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. Another famous phrase that he uses that has stuck with us is he says, in the state of nature, human relationships are the war of all against all.
Right.
And of course, as he's writing this, he's like, you know, no one wants that. That's a base assumption. So how do we fix that problem? And what Hobbes ends up with is... Funny enough, he uses a biblical image. And so he says what we need is not necessarily a certain form of government, but a power that's strong enough to impose order. And the name that he gives to this power is Leviathan. Mm-hmm. And so Hobbes writes this famous book on political theory. And you can read the book if you want to. I mean, maybe we'll do a book club as sort of an offshoot of the show. But even looking at the frontispiece, the frontispiece, the cover art of the book, you kind of get a sense of what he's about. So Hobbes has this image of a quaint, like, European village. And behind the village, kind of like in the landscape behind it, there's this large figure who looks like a king. In one hand, he's holding a scepter, like a sort of like religious artifact, and in another, a sword. And so this is the figure who bears the sword. But what's interesting in the way that it's drawn is that if you look closely, the body of this kingly figure is made up of all of the individual bodies of the village people, and their backs are turned...
And not the band, the people who are in the village.
Right.
The villagers. I'm kidding, go ahead.
And the backs of the backs of the villagers are turned towards, like, sort of, you can't see their faces, but it looks like they're gazing in awe at the visage of Leviathan.
Yep.
And again, like Bo briefly touched on sort of like what was the old basis for unity in European cultures. It was the church being at the center, the Eucharist as sort of like the foundational human activity. This sort of apes or imitates the Eucharist, whereas like these European villagers, their focus is no longer on the consecrated hosts, but they stand in awe of Leviathan. And you know this to be the case in part because Hobbes on this artwork, he quotes a verse from Scripture. It's Job 41:24. In Latin, he has it in Latin, non est potestas super terram quae comparator a. Sorry there. Translated in English, there is no power on earth which can be compared to him. So in Hobbes, we have the beginning of what's called social contract theory, where the citizens of an entire society, they may not sign a piece of paper per se, But we all set aside like our own sort of prerogative to protect ourselves and to establish our individual rights. We hand it over to an absolutist governing authority. In this case, Hobbes, he says, it's convenient to have a monarch for different reasons.
The monopoly on violence.
Right. And so we've shifted the basis, like a kind of classical understanding of the common good and the formation of society. And we end up with this Hobbesian order that is meant to spare us from the war of all against all.
And that to me is what's interesting is social contract, especially if you heard it in, civics class, or there's probably like a Schoolhouse Rock that's about social contract theory that makes it sound like very nice, but it's based off of a theory that goes, from my rationalist perch, what I see of humans is a total irrational, violent brutality that is a war of all against all that could only be wrested from them if we force them to implicitly sign a social contract where they hand over their prerogative for violent self-protection or infliction towards others, and we hand it over to the state. So the state creates a negative peace, Bud, and this is essential. We'll get to this in the second half. We're coming up a little bit here on time for the first half. So peace is not a positive thing, and it is not a primal thing. It is only negative. It is the creation of a space that isn't the war of all against all. And so liberal freedom and liberal peace, and I don't mean this in liberal conservative, I mean liberal enlightenment from the social contract theory, is as long as you don't mess with someone else, you can do whatever you want. And so the war of all against all is an establishment by a superior force to make there be order where by nature there should not be any. And Bud, when you transfer this into leadership, again, leaders aren't going to talk about this in this way. They're not going to bring up that they're Leviathan, but it's precisely the way that most leadership works if you actually really press. The idea is you can't get a band of people together, the implicit assumption, you can't get a band of people together and then work. Yeah. They'll be too self-interested. They'll undercut each other. There won't be enough of a threat for them to behave, to put in the hours and things like this. So what do you need? You need a Leviathan, you need a leader, and you also need, and Hobbes would agree with this too in his own way, an apparatus of the state, so what eventually becomes bureaucracies, to force people to have the same goal. Yeah. And it's funny because in this way too, if you think about a business, a family, a church, or anything, this assumption of social organization says you can do whatever you want. You just can't impede A, anyone else, and B, the authority of the Leviathan, the authority of the leader. But I'm sad to say that I think a lot of people in their experience in business world, in civic organizations, whether that's like the church or the Kiwanis or whatever, or even in families, is instead of going, oh, there's this sort of original piece we're trying to get back to or maintain, it really is, I learned not to make the boss mad. Yeah. And I learned to keep to myself. And the idea of that leadership is to say, unless you coerce people, and mostly implicitly, you can't have explicitly every so often, but you got to show everyone that Leviathan means business. But the most important part is the implicit part, which is to say, we all signed this social contract, and it's crazy how often you think of, we've talked about the poison and toxic way in which people will demand that like a workforce, like we're a family, we're in this together, which is a nice way to say like, you're all the villagers that make up the body of Leviathan, but you better be pointed at the head of the crown and not disturb it. Yeah. And, to me, as we close out here, that's one of the things that's hard for people to understand when you criticize this, because, Bud, sitting here in the most powerful economy and military in the world, it surely looks like, didn't this achieve the peace that we've been talking about? Now, not to go off into this too much, but of course we've said in prior episodes, sure, but this is at the hand of, let's just do something that everyone who's listening to this agrees upon. The backs of millions of dead children due to abortion, the backs of many different injustices that have happened. We clear the violence that is necessary to make this peace seem like peace and ignore it, but at the sake of the degradation of our souls. And this is something that John Paul II made a big deal about. So we're hitting the break here. When we come back, We'll play this out more and actually talk about how another darling of a certain sort of modern philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche, plays into this, but then also what is the Christian response. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. We are rolling along, closing up not the entirety of the Reconsidered Leader, but this first theoretical section. So, Bud, we've been talking about Thomas Hobbes, his idea of the social contract. The way I hope people are hearing that it has a lot of worries when it comes to a Catholic worldview, but also how that really does affect how leaders operate in many ways.
Yeah, and you did a good job in the first part of the show, I think, of bringing us back to some leadership ideas. I wanted to almost like purely geek out, and I was getting kind of deep into Hobbes' philosophy. But I think this was a point you were gesturing at. I can flesh it out a bit more. If you pay attention, you'll see Hobbesian ideas come up in conversations at work.
100%.
And the way that I see it most often is that this idea that we can kind of punt on questions of the good.
Yep.
So let's...
Maybe we should just stop there.
If you ever want to kill a meeting at work, one thing you can really try is to say like, well, let's pause for a moment and get back to our core principles, right? Like, what are we really aiming for? And a lot of times what you'll stumble into is folks saying like, that's sort of like nice and good to think about, but like we need to consider the bottom line. And if we don't do X, like we're not going to be able to keep the lights on. And this kind of language like easily seeps into our organizational and work lives. Now, Bo and I have been up front on the show. How an organization like uses its money, its stewardship of goods is at the core of who it is. So we're not saying like just be flagrantly sort of, what word am I looking for? Like unwise when it comes to those matters.
That's right.
On the other hand, especially in the work that we do within our parishes, if we're part of an organization that bears the Catholic name, that can never be the sole or necessarily even like the primary consideration. So we've talked about medicine on the show before. Of course, because of the history of America and religious orders and what they did in America, a lot of our hospitals have crosses on them and bear the Catholic name. And at a place like Mercy One, which I'm attached to, they say there are these ethical and religious directives that we're committed to in principle. The church has given these to us as a gift. And so no matter what the government asks of us, no matter who comes to our doors, we are committed to these things. One of them being a preferential option for the poor. And so, even something like what sort of health insurance someone has can't be an ultimate barrier to them receiving medical care. If you're serious about those matters, I can guarantee you as you go about your career, you're going to run into people who see you as a problem. And it's because of this sort of like Hobbesian understanding that human beings are sort of bodies in motion. We have to kind of keep things orderly. It's not about shalom, peace, fullness. It's about maintaining order. And in organizations, like we're blessed to live in a world that rarely issues into violence or anything like that, but it does issue into
violent proxies.
Right? Yeah. And this sort of like base, crass consideration of just how much profit can we squeeze out of what we're doing.
And, but I think the problem with Thomas Hobbes ultimately is it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It tempts people to think we are only on the surface level maintaining a peace. At any moment, any of us can break into absolutely selfish behavior and backstabbing. And so on one hand, that sort of gives like a wink and a nod to you. So you can do that as long as you don't disrupt the order, don't go after Leviathan's head, don't do it too much. But there's also this way in which, of course, that means it gives everybody, like you said, the absolute ability to punt on what matters most.
Yeah.
Or, and this is like my more dire finger pointed at multiple Catholic organizations, if we bring up supposed like first principles or things that matter a lot, it's for show and marketing. And I know that can seem harsh, but like that's the best way to sort of account for. People will talk about it in terms of their mission, or their constitutive values, their there are a lot of the ways in which they want people to see in an exterior way. But if those don't like get to the root of what you're doing, then they're obviously for show. And I think that the reason this is important, Bud, is one of our central things that we've always said to our students when we've taught Thomas Hobbes is that Christians have an absolutely opposite and opposed understanding of peace, which is to say peace is original. It's not made through force. And so even if we have to do things like just war, defend ourselves, intervene for the innocent, all of those things are possible. It doesn't mean absolute pacifism, which is a big conversation these days. But what it says is peace is primary, foundational, fundamental. Humans are not the war of all against all. Yeah. That is what sin has done. So even when we do things like corrective measures, even when we do discipline, Bud, what we're arguing is that we're returning to something more original and more foundational, and not doing something that is pushing to create a negative peace. But I think in the same way, Bud, that means that we have to start to talk about why do we bring up principles when we do? And this is where, like, what you just said at the opening of this really opened my eyes to this one. In the idea of a business or even nonprofits and stuff, Bud, the idea is, okay, we're going to maintain a peace because we have a goal that we're going to do, make money, get the word out. But otherwise, we don't care about what you ultimately think is important.
Yeah.
So pluralism... And I want to bring up that I do actually think there's a positive Catholic pluralism that we'll talk in a bit. But pluralism under the social contract is a way to go, nothing is as important except the one goal of us not being at each other's throats.
Yeah.
And so you're right, Bud. It's Hobbesian that so many leaders seem to be chickens when it comes down to it, and make people shut up, because shutting up and not causing problems is the social contract's most important thing, so you can get done whatever that is. The state can have a peaceful nation, a business can sell the widgets, and even nonprofits can get the word out, but families can just get by.
Yeah.
But instead of being willing to say, what are we really doing this for? What are the principles that are animating it? The best thing is to be like, okay, we've pretended that we've all listened now, be quiet, or otherwise the war of all against all might break out at any second.
No, I'm glad you bring up pluralism, because I think the proof is in the pudding, and a lot of times you see what people really think when they have to encounter the other. And so in our Catholic organizations and churches and things like that, I'll stick with organizations, sort of a shots fired, very brass tacks concept. And again, I'll just preface this by saying I'm not completely opposed to this sort of thing, but you get into workplace environments and there's this push to identify KPIs, key performance indexes. And of course, in Catholic organizations, the question of mission inevitably comes up, and it's well, how do we measure mission? And so we want to invent key performance indexes that measure this sort of thing. And again, it's this sort of drift towards can we concretize this? Are there metrics? Can we mathematically cash this out?
Bodies in motion.
Right.
Which again, real quick, just to your point, just to say, being someone who's had to lead people, I understand that you're can we make sure people are working?
Right.
I get that.
Right.
But there's it's a subtle difference. Sorry, keep going.
No, and then even when it comes to Catholic education, so inevitably in American society, 21st century, we have people who come to our doors who don't share our convictions.
Right.
From other faith traditions or no faith tradition at all. And the temptation, I saw this. I mean, I can pick on my own institution because I do think we've brought it to a better place. But historically, when we had the conversation about, well, how do we teach them quote unquote core values? How do we teach them to be servant leaders? How do we share with them the story of the Sisters of Mercy? The temptation was to say, well, let's make it about leadership, because leadership is less threatening. It's sort of
let's make it about Leviathan.
Yeah, innocuous, And so,
I never thought that.
They might find Christ a little too radical, and so we'll teach them concepts and values that track that direction, but they won't have to make a serious they won't have to have a serious consideration of what our Lord actually taught. Now, on the show, you've noticed we've sort of blended conversations about leadership with conversations about Scripture and at the core of the Gospels. But our goal was to never make it sort of digestible enough for people to swallow, right?
Right. It's the opposite way.
And so you don't want this is a challenging conversation, but at a Catholic school where you have students in your hallways who are not Catholic, how do you still go about these conversations? And I think a sort of Hobbesian eject button is to say well, we're going to water it down enough so that it's palpable.
Yeah.
Now, the flip side, we do want to guard against the caution of like, we've never been this sort of like dogmatic, like you take this theology course and at the end of it, you'll sign in your own blood that you believe the Apostles' Creed. But we do want to share with folks, like, leadership at its core for us, like it really cannot be understood in a key that sets aside Christ. And it's just, it's a lack of integrity to, in our parishes, like say, this is the most serious thing in our lives. And then to like, when we get into conversations with the others, just punt on those questions.
Okay. But this is what I was thinking about, like the pluralism that is for the sake of Leviathan. And then what I would call the quote unquote pluralism, this sort of diversity, that the church has always maintained as being important, which is very important because I know that you and I are with me on this one. It cannot be the case that like we begin to understand the church as some sort of like quasi ethno organization that it's just like only us and by us and for us. So, but we'll get to this because I realize, Bud, that you think about what St. Paul says in the constitution of the body, right? The body has many parts, but Bud, take the frontispiece of Leviathan. There aren't many parts. There are only two. There's Leviathan's head, and then there's everyone else. Mm-hmm. And everyone else does the same thing. They're all facing the same direction towards the head that is Leviathan. Their pluralism is, like you said, to water down, fragment, but then also to make homogenous.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Good. Your pluralism in the social contract is for the sake of homogeneity. However you say that word, I'm messing it up. It's to make everybody the same. Yeah. So it's funny. It's sameness through difference, right? Don't make any coalition too big and try to fracture them so that they all actually become just one thing: a citizen, an employee, a kid in a family. Paul is insistent on the diversity of the body.
Yeah.
There are many parts to a body. They do not have the same function. One is a foot, one is a lung, one is a finger, right? All of these ideas. And this is where the church goes. It is precisely the plural reality of the incarnate way that the gospel is preached throughout the world that we get things like John Paul II and Benedict XVI talking about the church breathing its two lungs because it's east and west. The way that all of the discussions about enculturation are real and important, right? How is it that we all have the same spine, but that, as it were, the ribs of the church are different and diverse?
Yeah.
This has to be the case. So just like we go, no, Hobbes is completely wrong. We don't create peace out of violence. Peace is prior to violence, and we actually use peace, as it were, to push violence to the side so that peace may reemerge. Yeah. In the same way, we don't use pluralism to make everyone the same. But what we say is if we have the same basis, right, if we have the same foundation, same principles, true diversity can come about. And a leader has to realize that. And that's where I go back one more time to go, if you're a leader and you think you would know something that someone else doesn't, you have to ask yourself why. Yeah. And it's not because you have some super rational position and everyone else is brutish and mean and in a war against all in all, and you're going to make the bodies in motion how you see best fit. It's actually to say that you've received it. You've received it from revelation or tradition, only meaning from someone else, someone before you. And your job is to unify the diverse plurality of the body because that diverse plurality is good. But to your point, even about missionizing, we think it's good there are people who have not heard the gospel, not because we think people should do whatever they want, because that means there's someone to go preach to. Yeah. And that God has given us that opportunity for the mutual enrichment, together. And I think that has huge implications for leadership. I think that also starts to make us turn to the next leader, anti-leader maybe, that we want to point to and then wrap up our answer to him. Yeah. When you fragment everyone and they become this homogenous mass of just citizens or just employees or just, members, whatever, what then happens is everybody, instead of war of all against all, it becomes you can do whatever you want as long as you don't impose it on everyone else. Now, what that first starts out is well, then I'm going to only find meaning in my life by doing my thing, consuming what I want, right? We get consumerist culture, identitarian culture. But rightly so, Bud, people start to buck against this, right? They begin to sort of feel the suffocating weight of the implied social contract, that the Leviathan is holding us all at bay. And so you're going to get a natural reaction to this. And the natural reaction to this, the only person, there's variants of this, but the sort of pure reaction over against Thomas Hobbes and his bestial war of all against all, subdued by the power of the Leviathan, is an equally brutal, violent, and imposing philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, who said all there is the will to power, and what a leader is the person powerful enough to impose their ideas on anyone else. And that, to me, is the sort of natural outgrowth, maybe in quote-unquote opposition to Hobbes. But really, Hobbes to Nietzsche is of one piece, even if they're just variants of the same idea.
Well, what I appreciate about Nietzsche, he's writing a little over a century after Hobbes, is that Hobbes says, well, you can sort of believe what you want, and it's okay if you have a belief in God or no belief at all, or if you locate your belief in like different, more exotic faith traditions or whatever, as long as you don't disturb the order. Nietzsche, he sort of takes the implications of some of what Hobbes saying, and it's on steroids. And so like he kind of sets aside the niceties, and there's this kind of it's almost like someone splashing you with a bucket of cold water to start the morning. There's like this very bracing feeling to read Nietzsche's philosophy, and he gets right to it. He has some respect for Jesus, but little for Christianity, in the sense that he said the way that it worked out is it became Platonism for the people, and it ended up in a sort of like resentment of the powerful. And there's this kind of envy on the part of the weak and the oppressed. And so Christian theology after Paul and as it fully developed is a form of resentment. And it's something Nietzsche thinks that kills the vital forces of human life. And so the brave person, the Ubermensch or Superman, will be someone who recognizes that we've killed God, he says, but takes that to it, like doesn't try to pretend like those old theological ideas are still operative, and so operates with the will to power.
And that to me is what is interesting when you think about, which I'm kind of kicking myself for not doing a better job of this throughout, I don't know, my life. The people that Nietzsche are primarily against are what he sees as the people who tried to civilize the Hobbesian impulse. But that immediately happens, bud. So few people what happens sort of after the 30 Years' War and after Hobbes is everybody goes, oh, the social contract's great. How do we make it not seem so violent?
Yeah.
And so you get these overlays, and it seems in many ways the liberal Enlightenment project in terms of politics, philosophy, and like social organization is how do you do the social contract but as nice as possible?
Yeah. Well, I think Nietzsche kind of recognizes that we talk in the language of social contract theory, but he says we're still living off the fumes of this old sort of like pious Christian culture.
Well, and but this is it, right? And so, yes, absolutely. What do? So after deciding that like religion is like too much, right? And so like the concordance, the Treaty of Westphalia, right? All of these things where we're like, we're going to make it where religion no longer, quote unquote, causes all these wars, which again, William Kavanaugh, this is like bad rhetoric.
It's complicated. Yeah.
But what I will say is where they get religion back in, and this is why, but why is it that, after, in modernity, religion is just like about sentiments and morality and things like this. Okay, religion can be let back into the conversation, but its job is to make the war of the social contract, the bitter medicine of the social contract go down easier, right? So it's about sentimentality, and then, Jesus is a nice teacher, Christian culture. Look what Christian culture has done. And the idea is if you coat the medicine of the social contract, these humans, right, who are brutish and war of all against all by nature, they'll swallow it better, and then they'll be nicer and kinder, and they'll listen to the boss, and they'll listen to the king, and they'll listen to dad. And Nietzsche calls all this out and says, if it's the case that all of this sort of architecture is built off of the resent-filled authority of the state, and then what he wants to say is the Christian sort of niceties placed on top of it, he goes, the real thing that happens is will to power. The people who are powerful enough to force everyone else to believe what they say about the social contract is all that matters. And the real way to be liberated from this is the force of your own will, to be Zarathustra, to stride above the mountains and not care about the herd.
Yeah. Well, one point that I want to raise, and I think this might be a good point to kind of wind things down with. Funny enough, in the back of my mind, I have Reinhold Niebuhr. And so, like, again, for the theology nerds out there, do a little Wikipedia search. It's fun times. But I've encountered other Catholics who So you think about the first segment of the show, and I talk about Hobbes, and they're like, yeah, that's kind of screwed up. And of course, Nietzsche, like they say, like the will to power, that can't be right. But then we move to like actual social and political conversations, and they say like, well, we have to have this kind of realism, right? And they say what you're talking about doesn't take seriously how human beings actually live and behave. And this is where, I think the ultimate answer, and I know we're running short on time, is St. Augustine and his account of human sinfulness. Yes. But this isn't a sort of like the response to Hobbes and Nietzsche. We got to be careful not to fall back into like a sort of romanticism or things like that. Christianity envisions an original primal peace, but it also is deathly serious, pun intended, about the outworkings of human sinfulness.
And I know, again, we're running short on time, but I think this will like open up the vista into our scriptural considerations. So, Bud, the will to power is just like, as it were, walking Hobbes back all the way to that first observation, which is like, who decided that you were the rational person who saw this and put the bodies in motion? And all Nietzsche says is, it's the will to power. Yeah. You thought you were strong enough and powerful enough and worthy enough to do it. So, Bud, how do we combat the will to power? Well, what did I say? Oh, you have to look at yourself in the leader and ask, where did I get this perspective? And I received it. I received it through tradition, or I received it through revelation. But the only answer to the Hobbesian war of all against all and the misunderstanding of peace and the will to power in leadership is prayer. And I don't mean that in a sort of like, all you need is prayer. If a leader just prays every day, they'll be good. What I'm saying is a leader who does not understand the source and summit and foundation of their leadership as receiving in prayer the way they need to guide their followers into the way of peace, a peace that is primal and before any violence. If they do not do that, Bud, every other theological consideration that we've made in the first part of this reconsideration is impossible. You can't have self-emptying leadership. You can't have anti-fragile leadership, apophatic leadership. You can't have holy leadership. You can't have anti-scapegoat leadership. Anything that we talked about, Bud, you cannot have unless prayer is the centerpiece. And not because like MC Hammer, we got to pray just to make it today, although, great song and true. It is philosophically the case. Bud, where do leaders receive what they will hand on? They receive it through tradition. They receive it from revelation. Yeah. That's the only grounding of the rational and peace-filled counter-narrative against Hobbesian understandings of leadership, against Nietzschean understandings of leadership. And Bud, I have to admit, I thought we would talk more about prayer today, but I understand providentially that the next scriptural part really will lay into the idea about how prayer is central to this. I think of Jesus himself, the Son of God, and the role prayer established as the foundational through point of his leadership. And I see that when we do this next part, that's exactly what we're going to be able to do. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imaging Ingredients, for underwriting the show. So, Bud, two things. That is sort of a stopping point, as it were, for the first part of the Reconsidered Leader. We'll have a second part that draws from Scripture, a third on the saints. But a real quick programming note, folks. I actually am going to be on a sabbatical in Europe for 6 weeks. It's pretty crazy. I'm going to a conference over there, going to give a talk, and then I'm going to be over there for my PhD residency. So please pray for me that I get a lot of writing done. But we're going to have a little bit different stuff in the upcoming month because of that. But when I get back from Europe, we'll get right back into part 2 of the Reconsidered Leader. Bud, what can people expect to do while I'm away? Well, you ended that last segment with a little reverie on prayer. And so we do invite you to join our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio. We pray the rosary on air really early, 4:30 a.m., later at 6 in the morning, 10 a.m., 8:30 p.m. You can catch the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:57 in the afternoon,
or jump on the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere.
And of course, folks, we cannot have this wonderful show or wonderful network except through you accepting this as your ministry. You make it possible. It's not just the folks behind the mics, behind the boards, or behind the desk. And we want to say thank you for all the time, talent, and treasure you donate, but we do need your material help. You can go to iowacatholicradio.com to donate safely and securely online, or call or text 515-223-1150 to make a donation to keep this good work going. But it has been fantastic to complete this part one of the Reconsidered Leader. Exciting stuff on the horizon as well.
Yeah, enjoy your little, I guess, pilgrimage to Europe,
right.
And we're interested to hear the stories when you come back.
Absolutely. I might have to do a decompressing good when I get back. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.